Okay. Sorry for the delay. Yes. Okay. All right. So faith. What is faith? Right. How do we define faith? Got a good biblical definition? Okay. Yeah. If we go to Hebrews 11:1, we've been here before, but let's just as a review, a reminder, because this is important. We start talking about science, particularly about evolution. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1, the Bible gives us a definition, and it's a very good definition, where the NIV says, now faith is being sure of what we hope for, certain of what we do not see. Somebody have a different translation, uses a little bit different wording there?
New King James says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen.
Right, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Okay. Right, exactly. And that's when we talk about faith. It's not a blind faith, but there's evidence, there's reasons we believe in it. Okay. So we want to keep that in mind. Okay. We believe in God. We believe in Jesus. We believe in the Bible, but it's based on evidence. That's what we've been talking about these last several weeks. There are some good reasons to believe these things, right? Science is meant to provide data and evidence about how things work, what is and what can be. But what a lot of people, particularly even scientists, forget is a lot of times it depends on faith as well. That they don't have eyewitnesses of the past. They weren't there. They're trying to reconstruct it based on evidence. But sometimes they have to have faith that what we see happening today is the way things happen in the past. And things may be different, but they make assumptions, right? And they depend upon those assumptions, okay? So it can collect facts and evidence, but then typically what happens, and we do this a lot of time, is we interpret it based on a point of view, oftentimes, or a bias, that we already have a preformed idea of how this ought to work and how it ought to fit together. And we all do it to one degree or another. And science is guilty of that. We're each individually guilty of that. And trying to be objective is a real difficult trick, but there are ways to help us in that. So just to kind of give you a way to think about this, right? We get facts and we interpret them according to a framework or a frame of reference, okay? So for instance, if I asked you, how fast are we moving right now? You'd probably say, we're not moving, we're stationary, right? Yeah, right? But well, exactly. I mean, if you compare it to the Earth itself, you're correct, right? We're sitting on the Earth and we're moving, yeah, right? But if you think about how fast the Earth is circulating the sun, we're moving at 66,000 miles an hour, right? We're hurtling through space around the sun. But now how fast is the sun hurtling around the galaxy? Yeah, something a little over 500,000 miles an hour. So right now we're going through space. And if we could think about space is actually expanding too, the whole galaxy might be moving at some other speed. We're moving really fast, but our frame of reference is the Earth, right? And so we're not moving. I mean, it's the same thing if you're driving a car and you see somebody right next to you, compared to you, they're not moving. But if I'm standing on the side of the road, it appears that both cars are moving very fast. And these are the type of things that Einstein pointed out, this idea of relativity, right? Things are relative to each other. So your frame of reference, your point of view, can impact how you interpret what you see and what's going on, right? So this is something to be kept in mind. And so when we talk about this in terms of science and Christians, we recognize that we can another way to look at this is our worldview. How do we view the world? How do we interpret what we see and what's going on? One way is through the Bible, through God is the creator of all things, and his word guides us. Today, you'll hear the word creationism being used. Intelligent design is being used quite frequently out there because people don't want to, they don't want to believe in God as part of it, right? They don't want the evidence to say that. And the opposite of that is basically what we call naturalism. They think everything came all by itself. There was no creator, there was no intelligent design. It all just happened all by itself, right? And this is basically where most scientists are today. And so evolution is basically a deduction from this thinking, right? From that point of view that they look at evolution, this is an explanation of how things got here and how things work, right? But part of it begins with the assumption there is no supernatural creator, right? They can't have the supernatural, partly because science can't prove it, right? But we see evidence that things have happened, right? So this is kind of the dual nature that we're battling right now. But if we look back in history and we look at a lot of very famous scientists in a lot of different fields, most of them were believers in God, and they believed in the Bible. They believed that God created it. And a lot of their work was actually founded in the fact that God created order. And we as humans ought to be able to discover this. Like Matthew Maury, he lived back in the 1800s. But people like Newton, you're probably very familiar with. He believed in God and, wrote a lot of things about math and physics. Faraday, Maxwell, Kelvin, astronomy, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, the ones that, figured out how the solar system and the galaxies work and stuff. They all believed in God. What's really interesting about some of those, of course, is the church itself didn't want to believe what they were pointing out, right? So science was discovering these things, and the church, i.e. the Catholic Church, was saying, no, it can't be that way, because they'd already interpreted it one way, and science saying, no, it really is a different way, as we've looked at some scriptures, and these guys were right. So, I mean, even from a religious standpoint, we got to be careful. We can be biased, right? And we've got to continue to look for truth, right? But in other fields, biology, Linnaeus, Mendel, Pasteur, Mendel did a lot of work with genetics, which is a very valuable field, and we use it today. Linnaeus is one of the ones that actually kind of created our way of classifying different animals, okay, that we still use today by and large, okay. But Pascal and mathematics, all these people, I don't really know these people, but apparently they're well known in their fields, okay. A lot of this comes, I have another book up here called Refuting Evolution, fairly easy read. Have you seen this book? Yeah, this is a pretty good book. It's about 20 years old, but the things that he points out in this book are still very relevant today. So this is a pretty good resource. Yeah, this is by Jonathan Safarty. So this is where I got much of my material for today. It's not my only source, but it's one of my sources. Okay, so we think about evolution, right? Most of us are probably familiar with some of the basics, right? Darwin's Origin of the Species, published in 1859. He theorized that all of life descended from a common ancestor through natural selection. And most of this work was based on what he saw in finches in the Galapagos Island. And I have a picture up here of some of the different finches there. And this was very appealing to scientists of the 19th century who were looking for an alternative way to explain the world. That through the 18th and 19th century and into the 20th, now 21st century, there were more and more scientists that were wanting to find and expecting to find another way to explain what we see besides God's creation, that nature could do it all on its own. And so this was very appealing to them. And so they have adopted this and continue to follow this. So one of the things, and this is basically what Darwin saw, and basically what we see today, is we can actually think of evolution in two different forms. We can think of what we call microevolution. These would be small changes in variation, either the variation that's already present and natural selection can select on that variation, or it could be that a new variant, some gene becomes defective. There is some mutation that causes a variation within the species that can be selected for. We're seeing that right now with the COVID-19, right? They keep talking about a new variant. It's still COVID-19. It hasn't become a bacteria. It's not become a different kind of virus even. It's still a COVID-19 virus. It just has a little bit different, projection on it that is maybe a little more difficult for our system to recognize. But, we've seen this all along. I mean, these are not unknown, right? And basically within the finches, I was actually trying to look and see, the question I have for evolution is, how do different species with different number of chromosomes arise, right? Because according to genetics, you've got to have the same number of chromosomes in order to be able to reproduce. But we know different animals, different plants have different number of chromosomes. How do you get there, right? We can cross a horse with a donkey, A horse has got, I think, 62 chromosomes. A donkey's got 64, and you get a mule that's got 63, but it cannot reproduce. It can't reproduce, right? So how do you get, and people will say, well, the horse and the donkey came from a common ancestor. Well, how many chromosomes did they have? And how did you get from 62 to 64 or whatever number these were? How do you get there? It's a discrete number, right? How do you get a part of one if it's in small steps? There's no, right? You can't have half a chromosome, right? Or a part of a chromosome. It's got to be all there or nothing. And I was trying to see, oh, how many chromosomes do these finches have? I suspect they've all got the same number. So I would not be surprised seeing different finches in different niches on different islands having some differences, right? It kind of makes sense. But to extrapolate that back and say that everything had to evolve this way, they can't get there, right? And that's what I want to try and show about some of these things, okay? However, I mean, we would recognize this as just variation. Natural selection can select on the variation. And we do this as humans, right? I mean, think about our dogs, how many different breeds of dogs there are. And yet they're genetically, they can interbreed with wolves, right? I mean, that's kind of, we domesticated a wolf to get a dog. And we've got many different breeds, but we've selected for certain characteristics, right? And we've done this with wheat. We've done it with many different things. Oh, I'm sorry, Stephen.
So I think an important point too is with microevolution, there's no information being gained.
Correct.
In the genetic code,
Yes.
the genetic code loses a bit of information and
Yes.
to create something that previously happened.
Yeah.
So you can't unmicroevolve because you've lost that information. It's gone now.
Right. Yeah. Often, you're
Yeah.
correct. Oftentimes you end up losing information.
Information.
Right. It's not an information gain. Yeah. It's like polar bears. They have white fur. They basically have lost the ability to be able to produce black and brown fur. Well, it actually makes them well adapted for the polar regions, right? Gives them camouflage, but it still was a loss of some genetic information.
Essentially, that common ancestor that everything evolved from would have to have the information within its genetic
Yes.
code to create everything that we have today.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the largest difficulties, but it's also one of the things and I'll get to kind of where they hang their hat in this whole thing here in a few minutes. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. But this comes from a slide presentation, but it's talking about the same kind of thing. But they use the term evolution in here, talking about how these finches, these Galapagos finches, apparently in 1982, there was a large ground finch that actually ended up changing the beak size of another species of finch on there because of the competition for food, right? And they would have these drought where certain types of seed were not in high availability. And so there was an adaptive selection for small beaks as opposed to the big beaks. They could take advantage of the small seeds, the big beak ones could not. But this was variation that already existed within the population. And that's all it was doing, selecting for those things. And they would have like an El Nino that actually got wetter, and then they would end up selecting for the large beaks again. So you have these back and forth swings, but it's all according to what's already present within the genome, right? Okay. Darwin, this is his, I think this is the only drawing that was actually in his book. This is from 1937. Basically wrote, I think, and it's basically trying this tree of life. He basically says everything starts here and then it branches off and continues branching. This was his concept, right? That everything had a common ancestor and everything branched off from them, okay? But this was also Darwin's biggest concern. When you read his book, he comes down to this, he says, why then is not every geologic formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? The idea back here is you would find these nodes that there should be a common ancestor to whatever this is and whatever this is. And out here, there should be a common ancestor for this one and this one and this one. But what he was finding that those intermediate ancestors did not exist in the fossil record. So he wrote in his book, why then is not every geologic formation, every stratum full of such intermediate links? If what he is saying is true, why is it not there? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geologic record. Okay. Yeah. I mean, and this is what true science should do. I mean, it points out what is the, what are the objections, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses that people can go and test, right? And so he's very upfront in stating this, which is really quite interesting. He says the geologic record does not reveal any finely graduated organic change. And he was thinking that there'd be slow change over time, and there'd be this, this evolution, these divergence into different species and different orders and all these things. But the fossil record was not showing such things, right? We weren't finding the intermediate links. We weren't finding this gradation. We're just finding species out there. And this was a grave objection. I meant to bring in, I actually have an evolutionary analysis textbook. And in it, it talks about the objections to evolution, and they don't mention this one. They mention some other ones, which they actually can kind of talk about a little bit, but this one they cannot. They don't mention it all. Yeah, but it is an important thing. Okay, and anybody ever heard of the Cambrian explosion? I mean, if you look at what paleontologists and geologists say about the fossil record and about the age of rocks, that's a whole separate discussion. But when you look at this one particular layer, this Cambrian area, they found that there was basically what they called an explosion of different animal types. And it was like complete body forms, fully functioning body form, different forms, right? Like we've got like insects and crabs, and you'd have sponges, and you'd have, reptiles and so forth. They're all distinct body plans and body forms. And they found in the Cambrian area, they found lots of different new forms, to which the previous, like, there's nothing there. There was like the fossil record seemed to show like single-celled animals or maybe some sponges, but some very minute. And all of a sudden you've got these, and this is one of them. I'm showing this picture right here. This is one of the body plans there. Very, very weird creatures. I think this book, it's another book that I'm reading. I just have on Kindle called Darwin's Doubt. That gets into, it's like a 400-page novel. I'm only about 30% way through, that gets into a lot of these different creatures that show up and how do you explain them. And I've got a couple of quotes here. One of them is an increasing number of evolutionary biologists have noted natural selection explains only the survival of the fittest, not the arrival of the fittest, which I thought is a good thing because it's true. I mean, we can use natural selection to explain how things survive, but it doesn't show how they arrived, how they got here, right? This is then a problem, okay? This is in, Stephen Meyer's a really good scientific author in this field, Darwin's Doubt, which I'm reading right now. But part of this, they had actually discovered, I think it was back in about 1912, I think up in Canada, they had found this fossil bed field that had a lot of these new forms we'd never seen before. And then also in England, they started exploring what they thought, well, these are older rocks, there's no fossil, nobody wants to think, but some kid was out playing the field and said, hey, Dad, look at this. And they found some more of these just unusual fields of fossils. And then there was a huge discovery back in the 90s, this Chen Chang in China. And there was this scientist there that basically says, and they had this conference in Seattle, where they brought these people to talk about this entire explosion. So he was talking about all these different forms of life they were finding there in these fossil beds. So, and he says there was little doubt about the significance of the discoveries that Chen came to report that day. What was soon in doubt, however, was Chen's scientific orthodoxy. In his presentation, he highlighted the apparent contradiction between the Chinese fossil evidence and Darwinian orthodoxy. As a result, one professor in the audience asked Chen, almost as if in warning, if he wasn't nervous about expressing his doubts about Darwinianism so freely, especially given China's reputation for suppressing dissenting opinion. I remember Chen's wry smile as he answered. In China, he said, we can criticize Darwin, but not the government. In America, you can criticize the government, but not Darwin.
That's right.
And isn't that true to a large degree? Yeah. But I thought that was very telling. Yes, Joel.
Well, it's, you think about the theory of evolution and wanting to believe that is we know the creator, we know the creation in the Bible. And it's people that want to get away from God, and that's why they're pushing so hard. And that's why we're seeing all these movements, that are occurring today in 2022, because people are trying to get away from God.
Yes. Yeah, it goes back to, again, their fundamental worldview, right? And so they want to use evolution and trying to explain everything in terms of evolution, and it's hard for them to accept evidence that doesn't fit. And again, we can be the same way. So we have to be careful, right? In the Church of Christ, we can be the same way. We've got to, this is the way it has to be. And if other evidence comes, it's hard sometimes for us to see it. And so we got to be mindful that people, we got to find a way to try and get through. And I've got a slide or two in here when we get to it, I think is one place we might be able to get through. Yes.
It takes more faith to believe in evolution than it does to believe in creation.
Yeah, just about. It really does when you get to the bottom line. Yes.
There's going to be a reckoning though one day.
Oh, yes.
So
yes.
That's why it's important that we try to get through.
We do. Yes. Yeah. So I just kind of want to point out, some of these, because there's evidence that's coming out, again, like I say, the edge of the earth is a separate discussion, but even within that, people are saying, what we're finding doesn't fit. I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. Hopefully I can get back to sharing without losing this. Yeah. Do you remember a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about archaeology, and I kind of drew up on the board these series of circles. So if we looked at like all the people who had ever lived in all of civilization over time, and archaeologists, have explored kind of maybe a small segment of all of that. And within what they've explored or found, they may have actually sampled, this much, and maybe they've only reported on this much, of everything out there. They've only, reported about a small amount, but what we found within that supports what's in the Bible. And from that, as we continue to report out and we continue to find things, everything as we keep going out is supporting the Bible, right? Now let's take that exact same thing and let's look at the fossil record. So if we look at all animals who have ever lived on the earth, how many of them actually became fossils? And actually, that's another question. How does something become a fossil?
Gets rapidly buried in some kind of sediment before
Yeah,
things are able to
right.
take
I mean,
apart.
they want to say that it slowly accumulates, but you recognize in nature, things don't stay out there very long. Unless it gets buried quickly, it doesn't fossilize, right? Because it gets, the bones even get eaten up, right? So you got to have a quick burial for one thing. So very few become fossilized. Now, of all the things that became fossilized, how many have we actually discovered? Not very much. And how much have we actually reported on? An even smaller set, okay? And what we found within that, as Darwin pointed out, was the fact that, it doesn't fit my theory. So his solution was, and he believed that geologists, as they continue to expand out, they would find these intermediate pieces and they would fill it in. And what have we found in the 150 years since is it's going the opposite direction. It's supporting this, like we said with the Cambrian explosion, it's supporting the fact that these things came about abruptly, not in these intermediate stages. So the fossil record is actually going against Darwinian evolution, whereas things like archaeology is actually going in support of the Bible. So just kind of the very opposite effect is happening out there. Yeah, kind of interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Pretty bad, with the current knowledge that they had in the day.
Yeah.
It's gotten even worse since then, right?
Yeah, because he was
So-
expecting it was going to get better. I mean, his theory is elegant. I mean, it makes some logical sense, but the evidence has been what's been hard to come by, right? Okay. All right. So if I can go back to sharing here.
We're at time.
Oh, are we already? Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. I knew that was going to happen. All right. Well, thank you. Yes, it's so this interesting stuff. Okay. We've got a whole bunch more to share next week. So thank you. Okay. All right. Let's have a quick word of prayer, shall we? Heavenly Father, you've been good to us. And we're thankful for the time we've had together to study your word, to look at these things. And may we continue to help us to believe in you, to find ways to share our faith with others around. Well, your name be glorified. To Jesus we pray. Amen.